Hello, everybody. Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. We're moving on to our fourth year, our fourth season, and a very exciting moment for us. In season 4 of How to Fix Democracy, we're focusing on one country. Many of you, of course, can guess that country, the United States of America. Democracy in America is the subject of our fourth series, and where better to begin Democracy in America with the man who wrote the most famous Democracy in America of all, Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm thrilled that we're being joined with two of America's leading authorities on de Tocqueville, Cheryl Welch, who taught at the Harvard University Political Science Department. She's the author of a book on Tocqueville published by Oxford University Press, and Arthur Goldhammer, who translated Tocqueville's Democracy in America, quite an achievement. I've been listening to the book, to all de Tocqueville's wisdom, and it's an excellent place to start a series of shows about how to fix democracy. Is Tocqueville a bridge between the reason of 18th century Enlightenment and the romanticism of 19th century nationalist ideology?
Well, I think he is a mix, but I don't know if I would think that he's a mix of 18th century rationalism and sort of rationalist romanticism. He's attracted to kind of romanticism, but in somewhat of a nostalgic style. He's looking backward, so he's quite different than the Romantic poets. But he is steeped in the 18th century when, he's a young aristocrat. He reads all the books in his father's library, loses his faith, allegedly, and then becomes very much a man of the 19th century, in which he thinks the Enlightenment has to be chastened. And yes, I would say that his philosophy is also, and it's always been very hard to place, because he had actually one point said that he didn't have an ear for philosophy. I don't think he would have called himself a philosopher. So he's quite unique, actually, in that way.
And I think that's why we're talking about him. That's what makes him so compelling even today, the uniqueness of de Tocqueville, although he's very much in the French tradition, clearly someone influenced by Montesquieu. Art, the young man steeped in French aristocratic life comes to America. Very briefly, tell me why he came, what he was looking for, and how we get to this book, Democracy in America.
Well, there are two things to be said about why he came. The more profound reason is that he really wanted to understand democracy. He thought that the coming of democracy, the advent of democracy, was the story of the 19th century, would be the story of the 19th century to come. And he thought that it had taken its most advanced form in the United States, and a form less distorted than democracy in France, because the American Revolution was so different from the French Revolution.
Cheryl, was he a believer in the European aristocratic political philosophy? You say he's not a philosopher. Ideology, system, method of ruling?
Well, clearly not. I guess I would add one more reason for him coming to America, was that he was uncomfortable about swearing the oath, but he was also quite uncomfortable in the company of his very reactionary aristocratic family, whom he thought, at one point he said, they lived among the dead. He didn't want to live his life among the dead. He was quite ambitious. He knew he was a talented thinker and writer, and he wanted to contribute to the new regime. And he was quite clear. If he had one sort of historical premise, it was that aristocratic caste societies like pre-revolutionary France were dying, could not be revived, and they'd be replaced, and he thought this even before he went to America, they'd be replaced inevitably by societies that valued social equality, meaning societies filled with individuals who thought that they were of equal worth to anyone. I think he says someplace in Democracy in America, people who thought they could enter any profession, they could meet in the same places, they could succeed on the basis of their talent and ability. So this was not something you could hold back. This is kind of society, and he called it the democratic social condition, was the wave of the future. But it might or might not be democratic in the sense that people develop stable political representative institutions, civil liberties, a functioning electoral system. That was up in the air. And as Art said, that's one of the reasons he wanted to go to America, to observe Americans who he thought had actually had more social equality than any place else on earth, and had actually managed to create those institutions, unlike France, which was well on its way. It had a revolution to establish social equality, but was oscillating between revolutionary chaos and a Napoleonic dictatorship. So he was really quite passionate about trying to figure out how the Americans pulled off that trick. I guess
it was quite a trick. Art, you pulled off another quite impressive trip of translating Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Very briefly, how would you characterize his description of this new political system that he observed in America on his travels?
I think he saw it as a very finely balanced system in which power was distributed between the central government and state and local governments. So this balance you mentioned before, the influence on him of Montesquieu, I think you see it here in this idea of divided government, of checks and balances. That was very important to him as a means of ensuring moderation. One of the vices of democracy that he feared was the impetuousness of democratic decision-making. And he believed that this distribution of power among different levels of government would be one way of checking that impetuousness.
Cheryl, the Montesquieu link is certainly not mine. I took it actually from Raymond Aron's chapter on Tocqueville in his book about the founding fathers of sociology. Did Tocqueville, and there's some debate about this, did he come up with a theory of democracy? Was he a sociologist of democracy? And what was original about what he saw? After all, he wasn't the first European to come to America. Many others came and indeed participated in the American Revolution itself. Why is this book so influential? Why is his name so intimately associated with democracy in America? What did he see before anyone else?
Well, so that's a really penetrating question, and one that's kind of hard to answer, but I think that what Raymond Aron saw here was a kind of fresh, a kind of method of looking at democracy. And I do think that Tocqueville was highly original in a couple of ways. First was the question that he actually asked. Unlike many political theorists and thinkers, he did not think that democracy was fated in some sense. Equality was fated, but basically it would not bring along with it political freedom. And especially he was very skeptical that economic development, as we would call it, would bring with it political democracy. So he asked a kind of new question, which was, in an egalitarian society, which was given, what kinds of institutions, what kinds of social practices, moral values actually support democratic government? It was, I guess we might say, he asked, what kind of civil society and moral norms are necessary to make political institutions work well? It was in many ways an empirical question that had a normative thrust, obviously, because he was in favor of these democratic institutions. So that was somewhat an original question, drawing on obviously other writers like Montesquieu, for instance. And his method, I think, of answering this question or addressing it was also quite original. It was a kind of innovative sociology or anthropology, I guess you might say, in which he tries to actually map out the cultural and psychological dynamics of equality of a new kind of society in which everyone is equal. And it's based on a combination of kind of sharp observation. He actually talks to almost everyone when he's in America. Art has translated the travel works as well. I mean, he talks to everyone from John Quincy Adams to Sam Houston to the inmates of prisons. And he actually does, I think, want to interrogate them about this question. And he also implicitly and explicitly is always comparing this to the old aristocratic societies of the past, but also to democratic societies like France, which have not managed to achieve stable institutions. So he's got these comparative dimensions to his sociology going. And
if I could come in on this point for a moment, I think Cheryl makes a very important point. What makes Tocqueville the first sociologist, as Raymond Aron puts it, is that he made a fundamental distinction between laws and mores. Mores meaning all the manners and ways of being that people exist within a society. And he makes the very explicit statement that mores are more important than laws. Laws have a certain importance, politics has a certain importance, but before laws and politics comes this way of being. And the democratic way of being was something that he focused on from the first. Now, he's not a sociologist in the modern sense. In fact, when he tried to be a sociologist and collecting vast streams of data on the prisons, he managed to write only a very turgid and boring book that no one could read today. He was entirely impressionistic in his method of understanding the mores of democracy, and yet he was brilliantly insightful and able to convey that in a prose that really comes across and still speaks to us today.
He's a magnificent stylist. Reminds me of Nietzsche's remarks on Machiavelli, that there's a brio to Tocqueville's prose, to his way of thinking, that is hard to replicate because he was such a generalist. Cheryl, let's come back to this question of egalitarianism or equality and theology in Tocqueville's analysis of democracy. Was that the metaphysic, in his view, at the heart of democracy, or did democracy need a metaphysic, a core belief?
I don't think he thought that it needed a metaphysics, and I think he actually thought that when equality became a kind of metaphysical basis, that was a bad thing. So he was very, kind of critical of any kind of religious, the kind of religious romanticism that was very rampant in France. He thought that in his later work, he thought that the French revolutionaries had made equality into a religion. That was what caused some of the worst struggles and the worst violence of the revolution. So he was in favor of religion, and you know, I don't know if I disagree exactly with Art, but I think that while he had lost his faith, he still had a very Catholic sensibility. And he always hoped that some kind of reformed Catholicism, a few dogmas, it was quite compatible with democracy. And it could also coexist with what he obviously viewed in America, which was a very Protestant sensibility. And that those things could anchor democratic characters as long as they were not sponsored by the state. So he very much wanted to divide church and state, but he was very nervous about new forms of religiosity, Sansamonian religiosity, all of these things. He was kind of, he in fact wanted to take established Christianity and make it work. And he saw that was happening in America, which was why he was so positive about it.
Let's get into his political analysis of America. Of course, he's most famous for, or amongst the most famous observations, are those of self-government, of local self-government. Do you think that's his biggest contribution to understanding American government, this division of power analysis, which suggests that America is decentralized and the people govern themselves essentially in a collaborative, almost communitarian sense?
Well, I think there is a division among Tocqueville interpreters, particularly in the United States these days, in which one school tends to overemphasize the importance of local government in Tocqueville's writing and to neglect the importance of the state. You have to remember that Tocqueville was reacting against the state that was hyper-centralized. The French state descended from the absolute monarchy, reformed by the revolution, but never totally transformed. So the state in France was an outsized power. And the contrast he saw with the United States, where local governments took the initiative, where people did not stand around. In one of his most famous images, he describes Americans getting together to rebuild a church that has collapsed rather than wait for the state, which is what he thought would happen in France. So he admired this local initiative in the United States, but he did not, by any means, in my view, underestimate the importance of a central government for major tasks like dealing with foreign powers, waging war if necessary, making major public improvements like roads and canals. He saw the necessity of the state for all that. And I think some of his politically conservative interpreters in the United States today, who tend to be hostile to what they regard as an overgrown welfare state, infantilizing the people, a nanny state, if you will, make Tocqueville into a harsher critic of the state that he really was.
Cheryl, some critics have suggested that Tocqueville was too kind to American democracy. What's your analysis? Of course, he came to a country, pre-Civil War America, where slavery still existed. He acknowledged that and was not an unsympathetic writer and analysis when it came to the slave situation. Do you think he got it right, America?
Well, I think actually that his long-lasting influence, I think, indicates that despite his limitations, he managed to identify tendencies, contradictions, dynamics inherent in democratization. So he was more right than wrong, I would say. But obviously, he's not a totally reliable guide to 19th century America, mostly because this classic text that he created is in some ways constructed to as a lesson for the French. So he he sometimes distorts American practice. He sometimes leaves many things out that are not totally germane to his interests. And he
Such as, very briefly, what did he miss? What did he leave out?
Well, he missed a lot of things.
Such as?
Race was one of his most important blind spots. He did not see the importance of the racial divide in the United States.
But he did acknowledge it, didn't he? I mean, he wasn't entirely blind to it.
No, certainly not. He saw the evils of slavery, but he didn't realize what a profound influence it would have even after the slaves were liberated. He thought that liberated slaves would not be compatible with whites in the United States. Now, that's not to say he was a racist. He was anything but.
Yeah, and there is a sort of an irony or perhaps tragedy at the heart of a theory of a book on democracy and equality in a country dominated by the institution of slavery. Did he try to even square this irony, this contradiction?
So good. Here's something that I'm gonna, I think, disagree with Art about.
Good, Cheryl. We want disagreement.
Slavery. Yes, I think all of the French were quite aware of this contradiction of America proclaiming that it is a society of equals and it's based on slavery. And this is widespread. Certainly, the journals show that he is very much aware of this issue. But what I wanted to disagree with a bit, I think, with Art is that that race was such a blind spot for him. So I think that we should look at his most famous, perhaps, description of a danger in America, which was tyranny of the majority. This phrase at the local level, both tyranny of opinion and tyranny of law. So it was a great paradox, actually, that social equality, which causes people to want to judge everything for themselves, would lead to public opinion that was so strong that it became a tyranny, right? So how did this work? So under conditions of equality, individuals see no reason why they should accept opinions outside themselves. It's particularly difficult for them to accept any new beliefs that come from outside themselves. Yet, if they look inside themselves, they don't find anything. As he doesn't have a deep belief that they will find a natural law or some sort of reasonable rule. They only find doubt. So they become intensely anxious and restless. He uses that word all the time. So how do you anchor those opinions? In this circumstances, what everyone else thinks, especially everyone else who is like you, it becomes very seductive. So if everyone thinks X and everyone is like you, then X must be right. So people become slaves to public opinion. And, he says famously that, tyranny of opinion is so strong that it crushed freedom of thought. So how I want to tie this into race is that his primary example of tyranny of the majority was the treatment of the free Black population. As an aristocrat, he was quite aware of the deep prejudice of caste and how difficult it was to get rid of it in a society. And I don't think he would be surprised by the persistence of a very corrosive racism in America, because the circumstances of democracy actually could amplify and entrench this kind of prejudice. So I was thinking about this the other day and I looked at Art's translation. He translates a wonderful conversation that Tocqueville had with a Pennsylvanian. And so I have it somewhere here. I'm gonna quote from this.
Please, Cheryl.
He says, one day I asked a Pennsylvanian to explain to me, please, this is Tocqueville, how in a state founded by Quakers and renowned for its tolerance, freed Negroes are not allowed to exercise the rights of citizens. And they pay taxes. Is it not right that they should vote? And the Pennsylvanian says, do not insult us by thinking that our legislators would commit such an act of gross injustice and intolerance. So Tocqueville says, oh, so Blacks have the right to vote in your state. And he says, certainly, That's why, then Tocqueville says, well, why is it that this morning in the Electoral College, I did not see a single one? That's not the fault of the law, the Pennsylvanian says. Negroes have the right to go to the polls, but they voluntarily abstain. And then Tocqueville says sarcastically, oh, how extraordinarily modest of them. And he says, oh, it's not that they refuse to vote, but they're often afraid of being mistreated if they do. The law here has no teeth if the majority refuses to support it. But the majority harbors strong prejudices against the Negroes, and our officials do not feel strong enough to guarantee the rights that the legislators have bestowed on them. This is Tocqueville. What, do you mean to say that the majority, which enjoys the privilege of making the laws, also insists on the privilege of disobeying the laws? And I think throughout, he's quite aware that, and he says it explicitly, the tyranny of the law, that they are exposed to tyranny of the laws and intolerance of mores. And the problem is, in a democratic society, it's very, very difficult to change mores, as we started out by saying. So how do you change that racial prejudice?
And that's, of course, a question that Americans and outsiders have been talking about ever since. Let's fast forward to 2022, to an America, once again, riven by race, by political instability. When we look back almost 200 years after Tocqueville wrote his brilliant Democracy in America, can we learn anything from this book? Should we be, I mean, we of course should be rereading it because you translated it, but what's the value for Americans to reread Democracy in America in an America in which democracy is perhaps less stable, more fragile than it was when Tocqueville came in the 19th century?
Yes, well, I think one value is to perceive the ways in which Tocqueville's hopes for the evolution of democracy were in fact disappointed. Tocqueville believed that America had the advantage over France, that it began from a favorable position, a point of departure, as he likes to call it, that it was the middle of British society rather than the very top or the very bottom that emigrated to the United States, and that this middle of society came with a certain moderation. Well, that moderation has somehow dissipated since the 19th century, if it indeed existed to the extent that Tocqueville believed it did even then. But certainly today, this has become an extremely polarized society with extremely passionate oppositions, which are not moderated in any way by reason or education. Those are two things that Tocqueville believed would evolve in a democratic society, that first of all, education and learning would spread because public education was fostered by 19th century American governments, and that this learning and expansion of sympathy that would come through education would somehow moderate the political passions of people. That hasn't happened. So I think reading Tocqueville causes us to ask the question why that hasn't happened, and how that has led us into the predicament in which we find ourselves today.
Predicament meaning a divided America, an unstable America, an America of Donald Trump?
All of those things, divided, unstable, led by people who are not only lacking in intellect, but also lacking in character. Tocqueville feared that the people of greatest character might flee the public scene because politics in America could be such a bruising affair. And in fact, that seems to have happened, that the bad have driven out the good.
Cheryl, do you agree with Art's analysis that early 21st century American represents the greatest of Tocqueville's fears about how democracy could end up because of the forces of majority rule?
I do think that reading Tocqueville in the 21st century, one has this kind of overwhelming sense of disjunction, that is, of what went wrong. It seems clear that the most relevant lesson is that Tocqueville reminds us that stable democracy works only when there's a sense of common citizenship, a respect for law, practical political experience, a sense that your own self-interest is linked to the collective good. These lead to political virtues, he thought, pragmatism, the ability to cooperate, to compromise for some long-term goal. So these are all mores. And as we say, mores are the most difficult thing to change. And plus we're in a different age in which there is a greater threat. There's a greater need for centralization and coordination than there was in the 19th century. Tyrannical public opinion is magnified by social media. Material inequality is much greater and more institutionally entrenched. And he warned that that would be a kind of a disaster. So I think it's a very, very difficult question that we're left with, which is where should one begin to change mores? I'm always struck, I'm always on panels with many Tocqueville scholars are actually quite conservative. And what they would say is that Tocqueville would recommend that Americans have to try to be what they once were. By that, they mean we need to focus on reinvigorating Christian virtues, shoring up the family, even reviving 19th century gender roles.
Cheryl stole my thunder. When I was reading Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the more I read it, particularly his description of France, the more it reminded me of actually 21st century America. The inequality, the violence, the distrust. Has 21st century America become 19th century France, particularly in its inequality? And when I was reading the book and he says, well, in America, there's no poverty. No one is ever without a home. In America, there's an infinite amount of land. In America, the government is friendly towards its citizens. All those things are so self-evidently wrong in early 21st century America that it seems perhaps that the most ironic legacy of Tocqueville's Democracy in America is that 21st century America has become itself a kind of aristocracy.
Well, yes, it's perhaps equally ironic that I'm the translator not only of Tocqueville, but also of Thomas Piketty. So
yes, exactly.
Tocqueville thought that equality was the most striking thing about America, but for Piketty, the most striking thing about America is its extraordinary inequality. It's one of the most inegalitarian societies of the world.
And we've actually had Gabriel Zuckman, one of Piketty's associates, on our show talking about that.
Yes,
French economist who teaches at UC Berkeley.
So this is something that would have surprised Tocqueville. I think another thing that would have surprised—
To put it mildly, surprised him. He would have been knocked out, wouldn't he? I mean,
yes, totally knocked out. He also invested great hope in associations. I mean, this is one of the great ideas that's associated with Tocqueville's book, is that Americans had this enormous penchant for association outside of government. But what he didn't foresee was that the association could work to divide as much as to unite. People come together in associations and can accomplish great things that no individual can accomplish alone, but they can also join in associations because they don't like what's happening around them and they want to oppose it. And then you have these fiercely, intensely, passionately opposed groups that can't find a way to speak across the divide. So that a penchant for association that Tocqueville remarked in the United States, I think still exists, but has had nefarious effects that he did not foresee.
Let's end with a return to fixing democracy, but specifically American democracy. Cheryl, if we were able to bring the great Alexis de Tocqueville back to life for a few days, and we could bring him to America, and you return to America, how do you think he would suggest that we can fix American democracy?
Well, I agree that he would be quite dumbfounded and would actually see that some of the things that he feared had certainly come to pass. about inequality, that chapter when he talks about, well, could an aristocracy arise of business or industrial elites? And he didn't think it could, but if it did, he had a brilliant kind of analysis of it in which he said, well, this would be the worst of all worlds because it would be separate groups that are only united by exploitation, right? And so there is he might find that there's this implicit category in all of the things Tocqueville wrote, which you might call aristocratic despotism. It was always a minority thing, but he saw that it did happen. He saw that it happened in Ireland. He thought that it happened in the American South. But he thought these things would kind of pass away. So he's actually, seeing that they had come to pass would be, I think, really quite.
And fixing America. I mean, you were slightly, I thought, critical of, shall we say, conservative Tocquevillians falling back on religion in terms of fixing democracy. What do you think he would or should focus on in terms of a Tocquevillian way of fixing American democracy? Very briefly, Cheryl.
Well, Tocqueville, I think it's very Tocquevillian to say that you always have to start with where you are. That's why you couldn't go back to aristocracy, and you probably couldn't go back to some idealized 19th century democracy either. So again, if you look at what he himself did, he actually had he focused on the performance of political elites in the legislature. He thought they needed to act as models for the people. That is, if there was polarization, if there was these divisions, if associations were at each other's throats, that at least you could model civic behavior in the legislature. And he constantly tried to get people to do that. He proposed modest changes in the legislature so that it could require expertise. He wanted to limit corruption. He thought a new bipartisan coalition should at least think about going to the country with a reform agenda that would at least sort of address people's grievances and inequality. So none of that worked out, obviously, for France. But I think that these Tocquevillian ideas about the need for far-seeing kind of leadership to push mores in a positive direction, and the only place you could really start was with political leadership. That would be the only wedge. They seem more relevant to me than these attempts to sort of restore some kind of nostalgic view of America that perhaps was not even true when Tocqueville wrote it, and he knew it wasn't.
So let's finish with you, Art. Cheryl is focusing on the education, perhaps, or the re-education of elites in America as a way of fixing democracy. What do you think he would? Alexis de Tocqueville would say if he returned to America in 2022 and saw a country which many people believe is on the verge of civil war.
I quite agree with Cheryl on this point. I think leadership would be his principal focus. He attributed his own insight into democracy to the fact that he was neither an aristocrat nor a Democrat. He was neither wholly one or the other. And he believed that in order to stabilize itself, a democratic society needed some kind of aristocratic element within it. Now, he localized that element in the lawyers, surprisingly enough. He thought that lawyers lived in local communities, but also had wider views with a broader temporal horizon. So I think in trying to rebuild a leadership in the United States, he would look for those ingredients. People, a group of people who had roots in local communities, but also by virtue of their professional work, had a wider, more global vision and a longer temporal horizon. He feared the short-term views of the democratic populace and believed that you needed a longer-term view which could only come from having a certain leisure to contemplate.
Perhaps send everybody to Harvard. How about that?
Well, I don't think he would want that kind of elitist institution. He would see that as a seat of aristocratic tyranny, as Cheryl put it. But he would like to educate people from within the populace to find a democratic form of education that would nevertheless give people these broader temporal views.
I want to thank both of you for a wonderful discussion as an introduction to our fourth series, Democracy in America. We will return to Tocqueville's ideas in later shows, and you guys will have will be named many times over the year in 2022 as we continue the series. So Cheryl Welch and Arthur Goldhammer, thank you so much for your contribution to How to Fix Democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.